Hey guys, tonight we're stepping through the heavy oak doors of a medieval castle, and I hate to break it to you, but you're about to discover why your ancestors would laugh at your complaints about slow Wi-Fi. Picture this. It's barely dawn, and you're jolting awake not to the gentle chime of your phone alarm, but to the bone-rattling clang of metal on stone echoing through corridors that haven't seen proper heating in centuries. The air around you is so cold that your breath forms visible clouds, and that's inside the castle walls. You're lying on what passes for a bed, essentially a wooden frame stuffed with straw that's probably older than your great-grandmother. And trust me, smells like it too. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're squinting through the gloom, trying to make sense of your surroundings, when you realize that the gentle pattering sound isn't rain against the windows, it's water dripping through the stone ceiling onto the rush-covered floor below. Medieval castles, for all their imposing grandeur from the outside, were essentially drafty stone prisons that trapped cold air like a medieval refrigerator. The walls around you are thick enough to stop a siege engine, but they're also porous enough that moisture seeps through constantly, creating a perpetual dampness that settles into your bones and never quite leaves. The temperature inside these stone fortresses was absolutely brutal. Even in summer, castle interiors remained uncomfortably cold, but in winter, they became death traps for anyone not accustomed to living in what was essentially a controlled cave. The thick stone walls that provided protection from arrows and siege engines also acted as massive heat sinks, absorbing any warmth during the day and radiating cold throughout the night. Your modern body, accustomed to central heating and insulation, is already going into shock from the relentless chill that seems to seep directly into your marrow. The room you've awakened in is what medieval people generously called a solar, supposedly the best private chamber in the castle, reserved for nobility or honored guests. But privacy, as you're about to learn, is a modern luxury that simply didn't exist in medieval times. You hear footsteps approaching, and before you can even think about covering yourself or looking presentable, a servant bursts through your door without knocking. Privacy wasn't just uncommon, it was actively discouraged. Medieval society operated on the principle that isolation bred sinful thoughts. So doors remained open, conversations were public, and your most intimate moments were always subject to interruption by servants, guards, or random castle inhabitants going about their business. The servant who's just invaded your space is carrying what appears to be a bowl of water, but as they approach, you catch a whiff that makes your modern sensibilities recoil in horror. This isn't the fresh, clean water you're used to. It's been sitting in that basin for who knows how long, growing a thin film of algae and collecting dust, dead insects, and whatever else happened to fall into it. Medieval people didn't change their washing water daily, or even weekly. Water was precious. Heating it was labor-intensive, and the concept of bacteria was still centuries away from being discovered. You're expected to splash this questionable liquid on your face and call yourself clean. But here's where things get really interesting from a historical perspective. Medieval people actually believed that washing too frequently was dangerous to their health. They thought that water opened the pores and made people susceptible to disease, which is ironic considering that their aversion to bathing was actually creating the perfect breeding ground for the very illnesses they feared. The wealthy might bathe once a month if they were feeling particularly hygienic, But most castle inhabitants went months without full body washing, relying instead on quick face and hand rinses with increasingly stagnant water. The real shock comes when you realize you need to relieve yourself, and your host cheerfully points you toward a corner of the room where a wooden chair sits with a hole cut in the seat. Underneath this medieval toilet is a clay pot that's clearly been used recently, and not just by you. This is your chamber pot, and it's going to be your intimate companion for the duration of your stay. There's no privacy screen, no door to close, and certainly no toilet paper. That particular luxury won't be invented for another few centuries. Instead, there's a basket of old cloth rags that have clearly seen extensive use, and they're not exactly what you'd call fresh. The smell rising from the chamber pot is enough to make your eyes water. But you're quickly learning that medieval life is essentially one long exercise in adjusting your olfactory expectations. The servant notices your hesitation and helpfully explains that the pot will be emptied later today. Maybe tomorrow if the castle's gong farmer isn't too busy. Yes, that's actually what they called the person whose job it was to collect human was gong farmer, and they were considered so essential to castle life that they were paid better than many skilled craftsmen. These specialized workers had exclusive rights to collect and sell human waste to farmers for fertilizer, making them surprisingly wealthy members of medieval society. As you're processing this information, another reality of medieval castle life becomes apparent. You're not alone in this room. What you initially thought was furniture in the corner starts moving, and you realize there are other people sleeping on makeshift beds around the room. Medieval castles housed hundreds of people, and space was at such a premium that even the nobility often shared sleeping quarters with servants, guests, and random hangers-on. Your roommates include a visiting merchant who's been snoring loudly enough to wake the dead, a young page boy who's supposed to be attending to some lord's needs, and what appears to be a minor clerk who's clutching a bag of coins so tightly that you wonder if he's planning to sleep with it permanently attached to his arm. The merchant, you notice, has what looks like a rash covering his arms and neck. Skin conditions were epidemic in medieval castles, caused by poor nutrition, unwashed clothing, shared bedding, and the constant presence of fleas, lice, and mites. Medieval people accepted these parasites as a normal part of life, even developing elaborate social rituals around delousing each other. The wealthy employed servants specifically to pick lice from their hair and clothing, and finding a particularly large louse was considered good luck in some regions. The walls around you are adorned with tapestries that might look impressive in museum exhibits, but up close, you can see they're faded, moth-eaten, and probably harboring more medieval wildlife than you want to think about. These tapestries serve a dual purpose. They provide a thin layer of insulation against the cold stone walls, and they help muffle the constant noise that echoes through castle corridors. Medieval castles were incredibly noisy places, with sounds bouncing off stone surfaces and amplifying until a dropped spoon in the kitchen could sound like a sword fight to someone 3 floors up. But these beautiful tapestries come with their own set of problems. Their never washed the process would destroy them, so they accumulate years of dust, smoke from torches and candles, food particles, and various bodily fluids from the people who live and sleep near them. They're basically giant fabric petri dishes, hosting communities of insects, rodents, and microorganisms that would fascinate modern scientists and horrify modern health inspectors. Your clothing situation is another immediate problem. Medieval people slept in their undergarments if they had any, and getting dressed was a complex process that often required assistance. Your outer clothes are heavy, layered, and designed more for protection from the elements than for comfort. The wool tunic you're expected to wear is scratchy, unwashed, and has probably absorbed months of previous wearers' sweat and body odor. Medieval people believed that changing clothes too frequently was unhealthy, and that their natural body oils provided protection against disease. This means your garments are essentially marinating in human essence, creating a funk that would clear a modern room in seconds. The clothing situation gets worse when you realize that medieval garments were incredibly expensive and were often shared among multiple people. That tunic you're putting on might have been worn yesterday by someone who spent their day mucking out horse stalls or working in the castle's forge. Laundry was done infrequently, maybe once a month for the wealthy, less often for everyone else, and the process involved beating clothes with wooden paddles and washing them in the same water used for multiple other household tasks. Historians still argue whether the medieval practice of wearing the same clothes for extended periods was purely practical, or if they genuinely believed it was healthier than frequent washing. What we do know is that medieval people developed sophisticated systems for dealing with the inevitable odor and filth that accumulated in their garments, including the use of strong-scented herbs, frequent applications of powder made from ground bones and ash, and simply accepting levels of personal uncleanliness that would be considered intolerable today. The castle around you is beginning to stir with the sounds of daily life. Servants clattering through corridors with metal buckets, dogs barking in the courtyards, and the distant sound of someone sharpening weapons on a grinding stone. These aren't the gentle morning sounds of suburban life. They're the harsh, metallic noises of a fortress preparing for another day of potential siege, political intrigue, and the constant struggle to maintain order in a world where violence is always just one insult away from erupting. Outside your window, if you're lucky enough to have one, you can see the castle's outer walls rising like stone cliffs, topped with battlements where guards pace back and forth, watching for threats that could appear at any moment. Medieval castles weren't just homes. They were military installations designed to withstand attack. And every aspect of daily life was influenced by this reality. The narrow windows aren't just for defense. They also mean your room is perpetually dim, lit only by flickering candles that create dancing shadows and fill the air with smoke and the smell of burning tallow. Those candles, by the way, are another source of constant danger. Medieval castles burned down with alarming frequency, and most fires started from unattended candles or torches. The wooden floors, furniture, and tapestries were essentially kindling, waiting for a spark. And once a fire started in a castle's narrow stone corridors, it spread with devastating speed. Castle inhabitants lived in constant awareness that everything they owned could be consumed by flames within hours, and many kept emergency bags packed with their most valuable possessions ready to grab at a moment's notice. Your stomach is starting to growl, reminding you that medieval people ate their first meal of the day much later than modern breakfast schedules. But before you can even think about food, you need to navigate the basic challenge of getting clean and dressed in a world where hot running water doesn't exist and privacy is a foreign concept. The servant is waiting patiently to help you, but their idea of assistance involves handling your clothes, your washing water, and your chamber pot with the same hands and the same casual attitude toward what modern people would consider basic hygiene violations. As you struggle with these morning basics, you're beginning to realize that every simple task in medieval castle life involves complications that would never occur to a modern person. Getting clean requires planning, assistance, and a tolerance for water that's been sitting stagnant for days. Getting dressed involves layers of clothing that restrict movement and trap odors. Even the simple act of relieving yourself becomes a public performance that requires coordination with servants and acceptance of sanitary conditions that would violate every health code ever written. The castle's morning routine is beginning in earnest now, and you can hear the sound of dozens of people moving through stone corridors, their voices echoing off walls and creating a constant murmur of conversation, commands, and complaints. Medieval castles were like small cities, housing not just the lord and his family, but also servants, guards, craftsmen, visitors, and various hangers-on who formed a complex social ecosystem that operated according to rules and hierarchies that would baffle any modern person trying to navigate them without a guidebook. The social complexity of castle life becomes apparent as you watch your roommates prepare for their day. Each person has specific duties, obligations, and relationships that determine everything from when they wake up to what they're allowed to eat for breakfast. The merchant must present himself to the lord of the castle to renew his trading privileges. The page boy needs to help his master dress and prepare for the day's activities. The clerk has accounting duties that, if performed incorrectly, could result in accusations of theft and subsequent hanging. Everyone's survival depends on maintaining their position in the social hierarchy and avoiding the countless ways that medieval life could suddenly turn deadly. Your modern body is already rebelling against the conditions you've experienced in just these first few minutes of consciousness. The cold has made your joints ache, the poor air quality is making you lightheaded, and the assault on your senses from the various odors and sounds is creating a low-level stress response that will only intensify as the day progresses. Medieval people developed physical and psychological adaptations that allowed them to function in these conditions, but your soft modern constitution is about as prepared for medieval castle life as a house cat is prepared for surviving in the Amazon rainforest. The servant finally loses patience with your slow progress and begins physically helping you into your clothes, handling your body with the casual familiarity that was normal in medieval times. Personal space and bodily privacy were concepts that simply didn't exist in castle life. People touched each other, helped each other dress, shared beds, and generally lived in such close physical proximity that what modern people consider intimate contact was just part of daily routine. Your discomfort with this casual handling marks you immediately as an outsider who doesn't understand the basic social norms of medieval life. As you finally manage to splash some questionable water on your face and struggle into your scratchy woolen clothes, you can smell something wafting up from the floors below. It's the scent of cooking food, but even from a distance, you can tell it's unlike anything you're used to eating. Medieval castle breakfast is waiting for you, and spoiler alert, your modern digestive system is about to encounter substances and flavors that will redefine your understanding of what humans are willing to put in their mouths in the name of survival. But before you can even think about food, you need to make it through the castle's corridors without getting lost, injured, or accidentally violating some social custom that could result in punishment. The stone passages ahead of you are dark, uneven, and filled with people who have no patience for someone who doesn't know the rules of medieval survival. Your wake-up call is complete, and now the real test of your medieval endurance is about to begin. The smell of breakfast hits you before you're even halfway down the winding stone staircase. And let me tell you, it's not the comforting aroma of fresh coffee and toasted bread that your modern nose is hoping for. Instead, you're greeted by a complex bouquet of odors that includes rancid fat, smoke, something that might charitably be called porridge, and an underlying funk that suggests several ingredients in your morning meal have been dead for longer than they should have been. Welcome to medieval dining, where the concept of food safety won't be invented for another few centuries, and your breakfast might literally be your last meal. You shuffle into the great hall, following the crowd of castle inhabitants who are gathering around long wooden tables that look like they've survived multiple wars and possibly a few plagues. The tables themselves are scarred with knife marks, stained with spilled food and drink, and sticky with accumulated grease that's been building up for months. Medieval people didn't clean their dining surfaces the way modern people do. A quick wipe with a dirty cloth was considered sufficient, and the idea that germs could spread through contaminated surfaces was completely unknown to them. Your breakfast consists of what the castle cook generously calls bread, though what you're looking at resembles a dense, grayish brick that could probably be used as a weapon in desperate circumstances. Medieval bread was made from whatever grain was available, and during lean times, that meant bulking it out with sawdust, ground acorns, or even clay. The loaf in front of you has a distinctly greenish tinge around the edges, which indicates mold growth that medieval people simply scraped off and ignored. They believed that slightly moldy bread was still perfectly edible, and in fact, some medieval medical texts suggested that eating moldy bread could help with certain ailments, an accidentally accurate observation that wouldn't be understood until the discovery of penicillin. To wash down this questionable bread, you're offered a wooden bowl of what passes for ale in medieval castles. Now, medieval ale wasn't the refreshing beverage you might imagine. It was thick, cloudy, and often contained chunks of grain and other mysterious floating objects that you probably don't want to identify too closely. Medieval brewing was an inexact science, and the alcohol content varied wildly from batch to batch. Sometimes you'd get something that was barely stronger than water, and other times you'd accidentally consume something potent enough to strip paint. The ale in your bowl has a distinctly sour taste and a smell that suggests fermentation may have continued well past the point of palatability. But here's the thing about medieval ale that might surprise you. People didn't drink it because they enjoyed it. They drank it because water was often contaminated and dangerous, and the alcohol in ale killed many of the harmful bacteria that could cause deadly illnesses. Medieval people understood empirically that drinking ale was safer than drinking water, even though they didn't understand the science behind it. So that revolting liquid in your bowl isn't just breakfast, it's your primary defense against dysentery, cholera, and a dozen other waterborne diseases that could kill you within days. The main course of your breakfast is a bowl of pottage, which is essentially a thick stew made from whatever vegetables, grains, and meat scraps happen to be available in the castle kitchens. The pottage in front of you has an unappetizing grayish-brown color and contains identifiable chunks of what might be turnips, some suspicious-looking meat that could be anything from beef to rat, and various herbs that were added more for their supposed medicinal properties than for flavor. Medieval cooks believed that different foods had different humoral properties: hot, cold, wet, or dry, and they tried to balance these properties in every meal, often creating combinations that would revolt modern palates. Historians still argue whether medieval pottage was actually nutritious or if people survived on it simply because they had no other choice. What we do know is that the constant diet of pottage, moldy bread, and questionable ale left most medieval people suffering from various nutritional deficiencies that manifested as skin problems, dental issues, and shortened lifespans. The wealthy ate better than the common people, but even castle lords and ladies dealt with food quality issues that would shut down a modern restaurant within hours. As you're contemplating your breakfast options, you notice that the other diners around you are eating with their hands or using wooden spoons that look like they've never been properly cleaned. Forks won't be common in Europe for several more centuries, and the concept of individual place settings doesn't exist. Everyone shares from common bowls, drinks from shared cups, and uses the same knives to cut their food and clean their fingernails. The spread of disease through shared eating utensils was a constant problem in medieval castles, contributing to the rapid transmission of everything from common colds to deadly plague. The social dynamics of the breakfast meal are as complex as the food is revolting. Where you sit, what you eat, and how much you get depends entirely on your position in the castle's social hierarchy. The lord and his family sit at the high table on a raised platform, eating slightly better food from slightly cleaner dishes. Below them, the various ranks of nobility, clergy, and important guests are arranged in order of importance, with each level receiving progressively worse food and smaller portions. At the bottom of the social ladder, servants and laborers grab whatever scraps remain after their betters have finished eating. You're trying to figure out where you fit in this complex seating arrangement when you realize that sitting in the wrong place could be interpreted as an insult to your social superiors, potentially resulting in punishment that could range from public humiliation to actual physical violence. Medieval people were incredibly sensitive about social status, and any perceived slight could escalate quickly into serious conflict. The simple act of choosing where to sit for breakfast could inadvertently trigger a chain of events that might get you thrown in the castle's dungeon. The bread situation gets worse when you actually try to eat it. Medieval bread was baked irregularly and stored in conditions that would horrify modern health inspectors. The crust is hard enough to chip your teeth, while the interior has a dense, chewy texture that requires serious jaw muscles to process. Worse, as you're chewing, you encounter hard objects that definitely aren't supposed to be in bread, possibly fragments of the grinding stones used to mill the grain, or maybe just random debris that fell into the dough during preparation. Medieval people accepted that their bread would contain foreign objects and developed the habit of chewing very carefully and spitting out anything that seemed too hard or too strange to swallow. The meat in your pottage presents its own set of challenges. Medieval preservation methods were primitive and unreliable, so meat was often salted, smoked, or pickled to extend its shelf life. The chunk of meat in your bowl has been preserved with so much salt that it's like eating a protein-flavored rock. Your modern palate, accustomed to carefully regulated food safety standards, is rebelling against flavors that medieval people considered perfectly normal. That slightly off taste isn't a sign of spoilage to medieval diners, it's just what meat tastes like when you don't have refrigeration and have to make it last for months at a time. But the real horror of medieval breakfast isn't just the food quality, it's the dining environment itself. The great hall where you're eating is filled with smoke from the central hearth, making the air thick and difficult to breathe. Dogs wander freely under the tables, fighting over scraps and occasionally lifting their legs on the table supports. The floor is covered with rushes that haven't been changed in weeks, creating a carpet of decomposing plant matter mixed with food scraps, animal waste, and various bodily fluids from the castle's inhabitants. The smell rising from the floor adds another layer to the already overwhelming sensory assault of medieval dining. Medieval people had a very different relationship with food than modern people do. They viewed eating primarily as fuel for their bodies, not as a source of pleasure or social bonding. This utilitarian approach to dining meant that food quality, presentation, and even basic cleanliness were secondary considerations to simply getting enough calories to survive another day of physical labor. Your modern expectations of dining as an enjoyable experience are completely alien to the medieval mindset, where a meal that didn't kill you was considered a successful meal. The breakfast crowd around you includes people from all walks of castle life, and their eating habits would fascinate and disgust you in equal measure. Medieval people ate quickly and efficiently, tearing at their food with their teeth, slurping liquids loudly, and wiping their hands on whatever fabric happened to be convenient. Table manners, as modern people understand them, didn't exist. Belching was common and accepted. Picking your teeth with your knife was normal, and spitting on the floor was perfectly acceptable behavior. As you're struggling to choke down your meal, you overhear conversations that remind you of another aspect of medieval castle life that would challenge any modern person: the constant awareness of death and violence. The people around you are casually discussing recent hangings, upcoming battles, and which of their neighbors might be suffering from which potentially fatal diseases. Medieval people lived with mortality in a way that modern people can't comprehend, and their breakfast conversations reflect this comfort with discussing death as a normal part of daily life. Your digestive system, meanwhile, is beginning to rebel against the foreign substances you're forcing it to process. Medieval food contained bacteria, parasites, and chemical compounds that would send a modern person to the emergency room, but medieval people had built up tolerance to these dangers through lifelong exposure. Your modern gut, accustomed to pasteurized, processed, and carefully regulated foods, is about to experience a medieval education in digestive distress that will make the morning's other discomforts seem trivial by comparison. The ale is hitting your system now, and you're discovering that medieval brewing created beverages with effects that went far beyond simple intoxication. The various herbs and additives used in medieval brewing were chosen as much for their supposed medicinal properties as for flavor, and some of these substances had psychoactive effects that medieval people either didn't understand or chose to ignore. You're beginning to feel lightheaded and slightly nauseous, which might be from the alcohol, the questionable food, or the various plant compounds that medieval brewers added to their Alesh without really understanding what they were doing. The social complexity of breakfast continues to reveal itself as you watch the interactions between different groups of diners. Servants hover anxiously around the noble's table, ready to refill cups or bring additional food, but they're also constantly watching for signs of displeasure that could result in punishment. The visiting merchants are trying to ingratiate themselves with potential customers while avoiding saying anything that might offend their hosts. The castle's clergy are blessing the food and offering prayers for the souls of the animals that died to provide the meal, while simultaneously keeping an eye out for signs of heretical behavior among the other diners. Your breakfast ordeal is teaching you that medieval castle dining wasn't just about consuming food. It was a complex social ritual that reinforced hierarchies, demonstrated allegiances, and provided opportunities for political maneuvering that could have life or death consequences. Every bite you take, every word you speak, and every gesture you make is being observed and interpreted by people who understand the subtle social codes of medieval life far better than you ever could. As the breakfast crowd begins to disperse and people start heading off to their daily duties, you're left sitting at the table with a half-empty bowl of pottage and a growing awareness that your medieval food adventure has only just begun. Lunch and dinner are still ahead of you, and if breakfast is any indication, your digestive system is in for a long and uncomfortable day. But first, you need to navigate the social minefield of medieval castle life without accidentally insulting someone important or violating some custom that could get you in serious trouble. The morning meal is over, but your medieval survival challenges are just getting started. The moment you step away from the breakfast table, the full olfactory assault of medieval castle life hits you like a physical wall. If you thought the food smelled bad, wait until you experience the living conditions of several hundred people crammed into a stone fortress with no concept of modern sanitation. The air around you is thick with a cocktail of human odors that would make a modern sewage treatment plant seem like a perfume factory. Every breath you take is filled with the accumulated funk of unwashed bodies, rotting teeth, infected wounds, and various bodily secretions that medieval people simply accepted as part of daily existence. You're walking through corridors packed with people who haven't bathed in months, and their approach to personal hygiene would horrify any modern health inspector. Medieval people believed that washing too frequently was dangerous to their health, so they developed elaborate systems for managing body odor without actually getting clean. They rubbed themselves with herbs and spices, changed their undergarments occasionally if they owned more than one set, and simply accepted that every human being naturally smelled like a combination of sweat, urine, and whatever they'd been working with recently. The castle's layout isn't helping the situation. Medieval fortresses were designed for defense, not comfort, which means that corridors are narrow, rooms are cramped, and ventilation is almost non-existent. Fresh air can't circulate effectively through the maze of stone passages, so every smell that gets trapped in the castle tends to linger indefinitely. The accumulated odors of cooking food, human waste, animal droppings, rotting rushes, and burning tallow create an atmosphere that's so thick you can practically taste it. The stone walls that provide protection from enemies also trap every unpleasant odor inside, creating a living nightmare for anyone with a functioning sense of smell. But the smell is just the beginning of your hygiene nightmare. As you navigate through the crowds of castle inhabitants, you're getting an up-close look at the reality of medieval personal care. And it's not pretty. The people around you have blackened teeth, if they have teeth at all. Dental care in medieval times consisted mainly of pulling out teeth that had rotted beyond saving, and most adults were missing significant numbers of teeth by their 30s. The few teeth that remained were often discolored, broken, and painful, contributing to the general atmosphere of physical discomfort that pervaded medieval life. Medieval tooth decay wasn't just an aesthetic problem, it was a constant source of agony and infection that affected every aspect of daily life. People lived with abscessed teeth that caused facial swelling, constant pain, and potentially fatal infections. The medieval diet, heavy in coarse grains and honey when available, created perfect conditions for tooth decay, while the complete absence of dental care meant that dental problems only got worse over time. Many medieval people died from infections that started as simple tooth decay, and the lucky ones simply learned to live with chronic dental pain that would send modern people to emergency rooms. Medieval people also suffered from skin conditions that would send modern people running to dermatologists. Rashes, boils, open sores, and various fungal infections were so common that they were considered normal parts of the human condition. The combination of poor nutrition, unwashed clothing, shared bedding, and constant exposure to parasites created perfect conditions for skin problems that medieval people simply learned to live with. You're surrounded by people scratching at mysterious itches, picking at scabs, and displaying various skin ailments that modern medicine could treat easily but medieval medicine only made worse. The parasite situation in medieval castles was absolutely epic in scope. Fleas, lice, mites, and various worms were constant companions for everyone from the lowliest servant to the castle lord himself. Medieval people accepted these parasites as inevitable and developed social customs around dealing with them. Delousing sessions were common social activities, where people would pick lice from each other's hair and clothing while gossiping and conducting business. Finding a particularly large louse was considered good luck in some regions, and people would compete to see who could find the biggest parasites on their bodies. These parasites weren't just annoying, they were vectors for serious diseases that could kill entire populations. Fleas carried bubonic plague, lice spread typhus, and various mites transmitted other deadly infections. Medieval people lived in constant intimate contact with disease-carrying parasites, creating perfect conditions for epidemic outbreaks that could devastate entire regions. The Black Death that killed a third of Europe's population was spread primarily through flea bites, yet medieval people continued to live with flea infestations because they had no effective way to eliminate them. But let's talk about the real nightmare fuel: medieval people's relationship with their own bodily functions. The castle inhabitants around you are constantly spitting, which medieval medicine recommended for maintaining health by expelling excess moisture from the body. They're spitting on the floor, on the walls, and basically anywhere the urge strikes them. The stone surfaces of the castle are covered with dried spit, creating a patina of human saliva that's been building up for years. This wasn't considered disgusting behavior, it was actively encouraged by medieval medical theory, which held that retaining too much moisture in the body could cause illness. Medieval people also had a very different relationship with nasal hygiene than modern people do. Nose picking was not only acceptable but recommended, and people would casually clean their noses with their fingers throughout the day, wiping the results on whatever surface happened to be convenient. Handkerchiefs wouldn't become common for several more centuries, so nasal secretions ended up on clothing, walls, and shared surfaces throughout the castle. Historians still argue whether medieval people were genuinely unaware of the connection between cleanliness and health, or whether they simply lacked the resources to maintain modern standards of hygiene. What's clear is that medieval castle life created conditions that were perfect for breeding and spreading disease, yet people somehow managed to survive in environments that would kill modern people within weeks. Some scholars suggest that medieval people actually had stronger immune systems due to constant exposure to pathogens, while others argue that medieval mortality rates prove that their hygiene practices were genuinely dangerous. The clothing situation adds another layer to the hygiene horror show. Medieval people owned very few garments, and they wore them continuously until they literally fell apart. The wool and linen fabrics that most people wore were never properly cleaned, just occasionally beaten to remove the worst of the accumulated dirt and debris. These garments absorbed months of sweat, body oils, food stains, and various other substances, creating walking ecosystems of bacteria and fungi that would fascinate modern microbiologists. Women's clothing presented particular challenges in the hygiene department. Medieval women wore multiple layers of heavy fabric that were impossible to clean properly, and they often went months without removing their undergarments. The combination of restrictive clothing, poor nutrition, and lack of proper washing created conditions that led to chronic yeast infections, skin rashes, and other intimate health problems that medieval medicine was completely unequipped to address. Many women developed serious health problems from wearing unwashed undergarments for extended periods, but changing clothes frequently was considered both impractical and potentially dangerous to their health. The menstrual hygiene situation for medieval women was particularly horrifying by modern standards. Women used whatever rags or cloths they could find, often reusing the same materials without proper cleaning. These makeshift menstrual products became breeding grounds for bacteria and caused frequent infections that could be life-threatening. Medieval medical texts offered various bizarre remedies for menstrual problems, most of which involved herbs, prayers, or bloodletting that often made the problems worse. The castle's waste management system, such as it is, contributes significantly to the overall aromatic experience. Human waste from chamber pots is collected by gong farmers and either dumped in designated areas around the castle or sold to local farmers for fertilizer. But this collection system is far from efficient, and waste often sits in containers for days or weeks before being removed. The smell of accumulated human excrement permeates the entire castle, mixing with all the other odors to create an atmosphere that would violate every health code ever written. The gong farmers themselves represent one of the most specialized and well-paid professions in medieval society, precisely because their work was so unpleasant and dangerous. These workers had exclusive rights to collect human waste and often became wealthy from selling it to farmers. However, they also had some of the shortest lifespans of any medieval profession, due to constant exposure to toxic gases and disease-causing organisms. Many gong farmers died from methane poisoning or infections contracted through their work, but the job paid well enough that there were always people willing to take the risks. Animal waste adds another dimension to the hygiene nightmare. Medieval castles housed horses, dogs, cats, chickens, pigs, and various other animals that contributed their own waste products to the general filth. These animals wandered freely through many areas of the castle, leaving droppings wherever they went. The concept of designated animal areas or regular waste cleanup simply didn't exist, so animal excrement was just another part of the castle's aromatic landscape. Dogs, in particular, were everywhere in medieval castles, and they relieved themselves wherever convenient, adding to the accumulated waste that covered most surfaces. The kitchen areas are particularly horrifying from a modern hygiene perspective. Food preparation takes place in conditions that would shut down a modern restaurant within hours. Raw meat is left sitting at room temperature for days. Vegetables are prepared with the same knives used to clean fingernails and pick teeth, and cooking surfaces are cleaned with dirty rags that spread more bacteria than they remove. The cooks themselves work while suffering from various illnesses and infections, coughing and sneezing over the food they're preparing without any understanding of how disease spreads. Medieval kitchens also dealt with massive rodent infestations that were considered normal and unavoidable. Rats and mice lived in the kitchen walls, contaminated food stores, and left droppings throughout food preparation areas. Kitchen workers accepted that some amount of rodent contamination was inevitable in their cooking, and they developed various techniques for removing the most obvious signs of rodent activity without actually solving the underlying infestation problem. Medieval people had developed an impressive tolerance for living conditions that would drive modern people to madness. They could sleep in beds infested with fleas and lice, eat food that was crawling with insects, and work in environments filled with toxic fumes without apparent distress. This wasn't because they enjoyed these conditions, but because they had no choice but to adapt to circumstances that were largely beyond their control. Medieval people who complained too much about living conditions were often viewed as weak or ungrateful, so most learned to accept discomfort as a normal part of life. The water situation in medieval castles was another source of constant health hazards. The wells that supplied castle water were often contaminated with runoff from the castle's waste areas, creating a perfect breeding ground for waterborne diseases. Medieval people knew that water could make them sick, which is why they preferred ale and wine, but they didn't understand the specific mechanisms of water contamination. They might avoid water that smelled particularly bad or had visible contamination, but they regularly consumed water that contained dangerous levels of bacteria and parasites. Well, maintenance was haphazard at best, and many castle wells became contaminated with dead animals, human waste, or other toxic substances. The process of cleaning wells was dangerous and expensive, so it was often postponed until the water became completely undrinkable. When wells did become severely contaminated, castle inhabitants might be forced to travel significant distances to find clean water, or they might simply accept that their water supply was dangerous and hope for the best. Personal grooming, such as it was, created its own set of hygiene problems. Medieval people used shared combs and brushes that spread lice and other parasites between users. They cleaned their teeth with twigs or rags, often using the same cleaning tools for multiple people. Hair washing was rare and involved harsh soaps that often damaged the hair and scalp more than they cleaned them. Many people simply covered their unwashed hair with caps or hoods and ignored the problem entirely. The sleeping arrangements in medieval castles contributed to the spread of diseases and parasites. Multiple people shared beds, and bedding was rarely washed or changed. The straw mattresses that most people slept on became breeding grounds for insects and rodents, while the blankets and sheets absorbed years of accumulated body fluids and waste. People often slept in their clothes, adding another layer of filth to the sleeping environment. Bed sharing wasn't just about saving space, it was also about staying warm in unheated castle rooms. But it also meant that diseases and parasites spread rapidly between sleeping partners. Medical care, when it was available, often made hygiene problems worse rather than better. Medieval physicians believed in bloodletting, which involved making cuts in patients' skin and allowing them to bleed freely. These cuts were made with instruments that were never properly sterilized, and the bleeding wounds were often left uncovered, creating perfect entry points for infections. Medieval surgery was performed without any understanding of sterile technique, and more patients probably died from post-surgical infections than from their original conditions. Medieval medical theory actually discouraged many practices that modern people consider essential for good health. Physicians believed that bathing opened the pores and made people susceptible to disease, that fresh air could carry harmful vapors, and that certain foods could upset the body's natural balance of humors. These beliefs led to medical advice that actively promoted unsanitary conditions, creating a system where following medical recommendations could actually make people sicker. The social aspects of medieval hygiene were just as challenging as the physical realities. Commenting on someone's smell or appearance was considered extremely rude, so people were expected to ignore even the most obvious hygiene problems. This social code meant that people with serious infections, open wounds, or other health issues continued to interact normally with others, spreading disease throughout the castle community. Medieval etiquette books actually included specific instructions on how to politely ignore other people's body odor and visible health problems. The economic realities of medieval life also contributed to the hygiene problems. Soap was expensive and difficult to make. Clean water required significant labor to obtain and heat, and clothing was so costly that most people owned only one or two outfits. Even wealthy castle inhabitants had to make choices between spending money on hygiene supplies or other necessities, and hygiene usually lost out to more pressing needs like food and defense. As you navigate through this human sea of medieval funk, you're beginning to understand that surviving in a medieval castle required more than just physical toughness. It required a complete recalibration of your sensory expectations and social norms. Every person you encounter represents a walking collection of health hazards that would terrify modern medical professionals. Yet medieval people managed to form relationships, conduct business, and maintain complex social hierarchies while living in conditions that modern people would consider uninhabitable. Your modern immune system, accustomed to relatively sterile environments and processed foods, is about to get an education in medieval disease exposure that will test every assumption you've ever made about human resilience. The morning is still young, but you're already being exposed to enough bacteria, parasites, and toxic substances to keep a modern emergency room busy for weeks. And this is just the beginning of your medieval hygiene nightmare. You still have to navigate the complex social hierarchies that govern every aspect of castle life, where a single wrong word or gesture could result in consequences far worse than any disease. Now that you've survived breakfast and gotten a whiff of medieval castle hygiene, it's time to navigate the social minefield that could quite literally get you killed before lunch. Medieval society operated on a complex hierarchy system that was part social order, part religious doctrine, and part survival mechanism, where everyone from the castle lord to the lowliest stable boy had a precisely defined place in the pecking order. The problem is, you don't know the rules, and ignorance isn't just embarrassing in medieval times, it can be fatal. You're standing in the Great Hall, trying to figure out who you're supposed to bow to, when you realize that every gesture you make is being observed and interpreted by people who've spent their entire lives learning the subtle signals of medieval social interaction. That friendly wave you just gave to what you thought was a fellow guest? You've just committed a serious breach of etiquette by addressing someone of higher social rank without proper deference. The silence that follows your gesture is deafening, and you can feel dozens of eyes watching to see how this social disaster will unfold. Medieval social hierarchy wasn't just about wealth or power, it was considered a divine order established by God himself, and questioning or violating this order was tantamount to heresy. At the top of the pyramid sits the castle lord, who holds his position by divine right and whose authority is absolute within his domain. Below him are various ranks of nobility, each with their own specific privileges and responsibilities, followed by clergy, wealthy merchants, skilled craftsmen, and finally the vast majority of people who own nothing and survive entirely at the mercy of their social superiors. The complexity of this system would challenge a medieval anthropologist, let alone a confused modern person trying to avoid accidentally committing treason. There are dukes, earls, barons, knights, esquires, and various other noble ranks, each with their own specific forms of address, behavioral expectations, and legal privileges. Addressing a baron as Sir, when he should be called My Lord, isn't just impolite, it's an insult that could result in serious consequences ranging from public humiliation to physical punishment. But here's where things get really complicated. The social hierarchy isn't just about titles and bloodlines. It's also about land ownership, military service, religious position, and a dozen other factors that create a web of relationships so complex that even medieval people sometimes got confused about who ranked above whom in specific situations. A wealthy merchant might outrank a poor knight in economic terms, but the knight's noble blood gives him social privileges that no amount of money can buy. A bishop outranks most nobles in religious matters, but his political power depends on his relationship with the secular authorities. You're trying to process this information when a young page approaches you with what appears to be a simple question about your business in the castle. This seems like an innocent interaction, but you're about to learn that there are no innocent interactions in medieval castle life. The page is testing you, trying to determine your social status so he knows how to treat you. Your answer will determine whether you're shown respect, ignored, or reported to higher authorities as a potential threat or fraud. Medieval people were incredibly skilled at reading social cues that modern people wouldn't even notice. Your clothing, your posture, your accent, the calluses on your hands, and even the way you hold your eating knife all provide information about your background and social status. The people around you are constantly analyzing these signals and adjusting their behavior accordingly. That servant who's been hovering nearby, they're not waiting to help you, they're trying to figure out whether you outrank them or whether they can safely ignore your requests. The consequences of getting the social hierarchy wrong aren't just social embarrassment, they can be life-threatening. Insulting a noble, even accidentally, could result in imprisonment, physical punishment, or even execution. Medieval justice operated on the principle that crimes against social superiors were inherently more serious than crimes against social inferiors, so accidentally offending someone of higher rank could result in punishments completely disproportionate to your actual offense. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed in the divine nature of social hierarchy, or whether they simply accepted it as the only practical way to organize society in an era of constant warfare and resource scarcity. What's clear is that the system was enforced with a combination of religious authority, legal sanctions, and social pressure that made resistance extremely dangerous for anyone who wanted to survive. The religious aspect of medieval social hierarchy adds another layer of complexity to your survival challenge. Medieval Christianity taught that earthly social positions reflected God's will, and that attempting to rise above your designated station was not just socially disruptive but spiritually dangerous. This meant that even thinking about challenging the social order could be considered a sin that could damn your soul for eternity. The clergy reinforced these beliefs through regular sermons that emphasized obedience, humility, and acceptance of one's divinely appointed place in society. But the practical enforcement of social hierarchy was even more immediate and dangerous than the religious sanctions. Castle guards were trained to recognize and respond to breaches of social etiquette, and they had broad authority to punish anyone who failed to show proper respect to their social superiors. A guard who observed you failing to bow properly to a noble might feel obligated to correct your behavior through physical force, and questioning their right to do so would only make your situation worse. The language barriers make your social navigation even more treacherous. Medieval people spoke differently depending on their social status, and using the wrong form of address or speaking in a manner above or below your station could instantly mark you as an outsider or fraud. Nobles spoke in formal, elaborate language filled with courtly phrases and references to classical literature. Merchants used commercial terminology and practical expressions. Peasants spoke in local dialects that varied from region to region. Your modern way of speaking doesn't fit any of these categories, making you sound foreign and suspicious to everyone you encounter. Economic relationships add yet another dimension to the social complexity you're trying to navigate. Medieval society operated on a complex system of obligations, debts, and mutual dependencies that determined how people interacted with each other. Every person in the castle owes something to someone else: military service, agricultural labor, rent payments, or various other forms of obligation that create a web of relationships that outsiders can't easily understand or navigate. You're discovering that even simple conversations require careful navigation of these social and economic relationships. Asking someone about their work might inadvertently reveal your ignorance of their social status. Offering to pay for something might insult someone who considers themselves above commercial transactions. Failing to offer payment might mark you as someone who doesn't understand their social obligations. Every interaction is a potential trap for someone who doesn't understand the complex rules that govern medieval social behavior. The gender dynamics of medieval castle life present their own set of challenges that could get you in serious trouble if you misunderstand them. Women's social status was determined primarily by their relationships to meanest daughters, wives, or widows, and their rights and privileges varied dramatically depending on these relationships. A noble woman might have significant power and authority within her sphere, but she could also be severely punished for overstepping the boundaries of acceptable female behavior. Medieval attitudes toward women were complex and contradictory, combining reverence for certain female figures like the Virgin Mary with practical restrictions on women's activities and legal rights. Women could own property and conduct business under certain circumstances, but they could also be treated as property themselves in marriage arrangements and inheritance disputes. Your modern attitudes toward gender equality would be not just foreign but actively dangerous in a society where challenging traditional gender roles could result in accusations of heresy or witchcraft. The legal system that enforces medieval social hierarchy operates according to principles that would horrify any modern person who believes in equal justice under law. Medieval justice was explicitly unequal, with different laws applying to different social classes and different punishments for the same crimes depending on the social status of both the perpetrator and the victim. A noble who killed a peasant might face minimal consequences, while a peasant who insulted a noble could be executed for their impudence. Trial procedures in medieval courts were based more on social status and religious beliefs than on evidence or legal reasoning. Nobles had the right to trial by combat, where disputes were settled through armed conflict based on the belief that God would ensure victory for the righteous party. Common people might face trial by ordeal, where they were subjected to physical tests like carrying hot iron or being submerged in water, with their guilt or innocence determined by their body's response to these tortures. The castle's economic system operates on principles that are as foreign to modern people as the social hierarchy itself. Most economic relationships are based on barter, service obligations, and personal relationships rather than monetary transactions. People don't just work for wages, they work to fulfill feudal obligations, to maintain their position in the social hierarchy, and to avoid punishments that could destroy their families. Understanding these economic relationships is essential for navigating castle life, but the system is so complex that even medieval people sometimes disagreed about what obligations they owed to whom. Your clothing is sending signals about your social status that you don't understand and can't control. Medieval people could determine a person's approximate social rank, geographic origin, and economic status by examining their garments, and your modern clothes don't fit any recognizable category. This makes you suspicious to everyone you encounter, as people assume you're either a foreigner, a spy, or someone who's stolen clothes above their station. Any of these assumptions could result in serious consequences if the wrong person decides to investigate your background. The castle's daily routine operates according to schedules and priorities that reflect the social hierarchy rather than practical efficiency. Important people eat first, sleep in the best locations, and have their needs attended to before less important people are even considered. Your place in this daily routine depends entirely on your perceived social status, and getting it wrong could result in anything from missed meals to accusations of theft or fraud. Medieval people were constantly engaged in subtle competitions for social status and favor from their superiors. Every interaction was an opportunity to advance one's position or to undermine a rival's standing. The people around you are not just going about their daily business, they're engaged in complex political maneuvering that could affect their survival and prosperity. Your ignorance of these games makes you a liability to anyone who tries to help you and a potential tool for anyone who wants to use your mistakes to advance their own interests. The religious obligations that permeate medieval life add another layer to the social complexity you're trying to navigate. Everyone in the castle is expected to participate in religious observances, and your behavior during these activities will be closely observed and judged. failing to show proper reverence during prayers, not knowing when to kneel or cross yourself, or displaying ignorance of basic religious concepts could mark you as a heretic or infidel, with consequences that could include execution. As you're standing in the Great Hall, trying to figure out your next move without accidentally committing a capital offense, you realize that the social challenges of medieval castle life are just as dangerous as any physical threat you might face. Every word you speak, every gesture you make, and every decision about where to go or what to do could trigger consequences that you won't understand until it's too late to avoid them. The morning is advancing, and you still have to navigate the castle's bathroom facilities, which present their own unique set of medieval horrors that will test your survival skills in ways you never imagined possible. Just when you think you've got a handle on the social complexities of medieval castle life, nature calls, and you're about to discover that medieval bathroom facilities represent a whole new level of horror that will challenge everything you thought you knew about basic human dignity. The urgent pressure in your bladder is becoming impossible to ignore, but finding relief in a medieval castle isn't as simple as locating the nearest restruments, a dangerous expedition that could result in everything from serious injury to accidental death. You approach what appears to be a castle servant and ask for directions to the bathroom, only to receive a blank stare and a confused response that makes you realize the word bathroom won't be invented for several more centuries. After some awkward pantomiming and increasingly desperate gestures, you're finally directed toward what medieval people called the garderobia, term that originally meant wardrobe, but evolved to describe the castle's toilet facilities, because medieval people often built their latrines inside their clothing storage areas, believing that the ammonia from human waste would help repel moths and other fabric-eating insects. The journey to the garderobe takes you through narrow stone corridors that seem designed more for defensive purposes than human comfort. Medieval castles were built as military fortifications first and residential buildings second, which means that basic amenities like toilets were often afterthoughts built into whatever space was available. You're climbing a narrow spiral staircase that's worn smooth by centuries of foot traffic, and the steps are uneven and treacherous in the dim light provided by flickering torches that create dancing shadows and fill the air with smoke. These spiral staircases weren't just inconvenient, they were actively dangerous in ways that modern building codes would never permit. The steps were intentionally built to different heights and depths to confuse attacking enemies, but this also meant that regular users had to navigate them carefully to avoid tripping and falling. Medieval people developed a special walking technique for castle stairs, feeling each step carefully before putting their full weight on it, because a misstep could result in a fatal fall down stone steps. The staircase leads you to a small chamber that projects out from the castle wall, and as you approach the garderobe, you begin to understand why medieval people had such a casual relationship with unpleasant odors. The smell emanating from this medieval bathroom is so overwhelming that your modern sensibilities are rebelling against every breath you take. This isn't just the smell of human waste, the accumulated stench of decades of use by hundreds of people, all concentrated in a small stone chamber with minimal ventilation. The intensity of the odor is actually dangerous in ways that medieval people didn't understand. The concentration of ammonia and other toxic gases from decomposing waste could cause respiratory problems, chemical burns to mucous membranes, and even unconsciousness in extreme cases. Medieval records include accounts of people who were overcome by fumes while using garderobes, though they attributed these incidents to bad air or evil spirits rather than understanding the chemical dangers they were facing. The garderobe itself is essentially a wooden seat with a hole cut in it, positioned over a chute that drops straight down the outside wall of the castle. There's no privacy screen, no door, and certainly no toilet paper. Medieval people used whatever cloth scraps they could find, leaves, hay, or even smooth stones to clean themselves after relieving themselves. The more affluent might have access to wool scraps or linen rags, but most people made do with whatever materials happened to be available, regardless of their cleanliness or comfort. The choice of cleaning materials wasn't just about comfort, it was about survival. Using the wrong materials could cause cuts, infections, or allergic reactions that could become life-threatening in an era without modern medical care. Medieval people learned through trial and error which plants were safe to use for personal hygiene and which could cause painful rashes or poisoning. Stinging nettle, for example, was sometimes used as toilet paper by people who didn't know better, resulting in days of agony that could make sitting or walking extremely difficult. But here's where the medieval toilet situation gets really dangerous. That chute you're sitting over drops straight down several stories to whatever happens to be at the base of the castle wall. Sometimes this might be a moat or a designated waste area, but often it's just the ground where people walk, work, and live. Medieval castles were constantly raining human waste on their surroundings, creating sanitation problems that affected everyone in the castle community and contributed to the spread of diseases that could kill entire populations. The engineering behind medieval toilets was both ingenious and terrifying. Some garderobes were built over streams or rivers that would carry waste away from the castle, but these systems often contaminated the water supply for communities downstream. Other toilets emptied into specially constructed waste pits that were supposed to be cleaned regularly by gong farmers, but these pits often overflowed or became breeding grounds for disease-carrying insects and rodents. The most sophisticated castle toilet systems included multiple levels of garderobes that emptied into the same waste chute, creating a medieval version of a high-rise apartment building's plumbing system. However, these systems were prone to catastrophic failures that could affect entire sections of the castle. When the main waste chute became blocked, waste would back up into the higher levels, flooding garderobe chambers with sewage and making entire areas of the castle uninhabitable until the blockage could be cleared. Medieval people had developed an impressive array of creative solutions for dealing with human waste, though none of them would meet modern sanitation standards. Some castles featured garderobes with stone seats instead of wooden ones, which were more durable but also incredibly cold and uncomfortable, especially in winter. Other castles had garderobes with elaborate ventilation systems designed to carry away odors, though these systems often failed and sometimes made the smell problems worse by distributing waste gases throughout other areas of the castle. The privacy situation in medieval toilets reflects the general medieval attitude toward bodily functions as natural processes that didn't require secrecy or shame. Medieval people often used garderobes in groups, conducting conversations and even business meetings while relieving themselves. The concept of bathroom privacy was completely foreign to medieval culture, where almost every aspect of life was communal and public. Your modern discomfort with using toilet facilities in the presence of others marks you as someone with strange and possibly suspicious attitudes toward normal human behavior. This communal approach to toilet use had practical advantages that medieval people recognized and modern people might find surprising. Group toilet sessions allowed people to share cleaning materials, watch for each other's safety, and continue important conversations without interrupting their daily schedules. Medieval people viewed the modern obsession with bathroom privacy as wasteful and antisocial, preferring to use toilet time as an opportunity for social bonding and practical collaboration. But the real danger of medieval toilets isn't just the sanitation problems, it's the physical hazards that could kill you in ways that modern people would never consider. The wooden seats of garderobes were often rotted, broken, or poorly maintained, and falling through a toilet seat could result in a fatal drop down the waste chute. Medieval records include numerous accounts of people who died by falling through garderobe seats, either from the impact of the fall or from drowning in the accumulated waste at the bottom of the chute. The most famous toilet-related death in medieval history occurred in 1183, when Holy Roman Emperor Frederick Barbarossa allegedly died after falling through a garderobe seat, though historians still argue whether this account is accurate or simply medieval propaganda designed to humiliate a political enemy. Regardless of the truth of this particular story, medieval records contain enough verified accounts of toilet-related deaths to prove that using a garderobe was genuinely dangerous in ways that modern people would find absurd. The waste chutes themselves presented additional dangers that medieval people accepted as normal risks of daily life. The chutes were often slippery with accumulated waste, making it easy to lose your footing and fall. They were also home to various insects, rodents, and other creatures that could bite or sting anyone using the facilities. Some castles had problems with rats that lived in the waste chutes and would occasionally climb up to bite people using the garderobes, spreading diseases and causing injuries that could become infected. The rat problem in medieval toilet systems was particularly serious because these rodents carried fleas that could transmit bubonic plague and other deadly diseases. Medieval people tried various methods to control rat populations in their waste systems, including keeping cats near the garderobes and using herbs that were supposed to repel rodents. However, these methods were largely ineffective, and most castles simply accepted that toilet use involved the risk of rat bites and the diseases they could transmit. Medieval toilet paper, such as it was, consisted of whatever materials people could find or afford. Wealthy people might use wool scraps or pieces of linen, while poor people made do with leaves, moss, corn cobs, or even smooth stones. These materials were often reused multiple times before being discarded, creating hygiene problems that would horrify modern health inspectors. The concept of single-use toilet paper made from specially manufactured materials was completely unknown to medieval people, who considered any soft material a luxury regardless of its cleanliness. The reuse of toilet cleaning materials wasn't just about economy, it was also about resource scarcity that forced medieval people to extract maximum utility from every available material. Cloth was expensive and time-consuming to produce, so even rags that had been used for personal hygiene were often washed and reused for other purposes. This practice contributed to the spread of diseases and parasites throughout castle communities. But medieval people had no understanding of how germs spread and saw no connection between their toilet hygiene practices and their health problems. Historians still argue whether medieval people were aware of the health risks associated with their toilet facilities or whether they simply accepted these risks as unavoidable parts of life. What's clear is that medieval garderobes were significant sources of disease transmission, contributing to outbreaks of dysentery, cholera, and various parasitic infections that killed thousands of people throughout medieval Europe. The social aspects of medieval toilet use created their own set of challenges that could get you in trouble if you didn't understand the unwritten rules. Different garderobes were designated for different social classes, and using the wrong toilet could be interpreted as an insult to your social superiors or an attempt to claim a status above your station. The best toilets were reserved for the castle lord and his family, while lesser toilets were assigned to various ranks of nobility, clergy, and important guests. Servants and laborers often had to make do with the worst facilities or were expected to relieve themselves outside the castle walls entirely. The quality differences between toilets for different social classes were significant and reflected the overall hierarchy of medieval society. Noble toilets might have cushioned seats, better ventilation, and more reliable cleaning materials, while servant toilets were basic holes in wooden planks with no amenities whatsoever. Some castle lords even had private garderobes with elaborate decorations and creature comforts that made toilet use as pleasant as possible given the limitations of medieval technology. The timing of toilet use was also governed by social protocols that modern people would find bewildering. Important people had priority access to the garderobes, and less important people were expected to wait their turn regardless of how urgent their needs might be. Interrupting a noble's use of the toilet, even in an emergency, could result in serious punishment. Medieval people learned to plan their bathroom breaks around the schedules and preferences of their social superiors, adding another layer of complexity to what modern people consider a basic biological function. Medieval attitudes toward menstruation created additional challenges for women using castle toilet facilities. Medieval medical theory held that menstrual blood was toxic and could contaminate food, water, and other people through proximity. Women were often forbidden from using certain garderobes during their menstrual periods, forced to use separate facilities that were typically less well-maintained and more dangerous than the regular toilets. These restrictions meant that women faced additional health risks during menstruation, when they were already dealing with the challenges of medieval menstrual hygiene. The menstrual restrictions weren't just social customs, they were based on medieval medical beliefs that considered menstrual blood to be literally poisonous. Medieval physicians believed that menstrual blood could sour wine, kill plants, and cause food to spoil more quickly. Women who violated menstrual toilet restrictions could face accusations of deliberately poisoning or cursing other castle inhabitants, charges that could result in exile or execution. The castle's waste management system, such as it was, operated on principles that would violate every modern health code ever written. Human waste from the garderobes was collected irregularly and disposed of in ways that often contaminated water supplies, food sources, and living areas. The gong farmers who collected waste from castle toilets were essential workers who commanded high wages precisely because their job was so dangerous and unpleasant. Many gong farmers died from exposure to toxic gases or from injuries sustained while working in waste-filled chutes and pits. The gong farmer profession was both lucrative and deadly, attracting people who were desperate enough to risk their lives for higher wages than most medieval occupations offered. These specialized workers had exclusive rights to collect and sell human waste, creating a monopoly that made successful gong farmers relatively wealthy. However, the average lifespan of a gong farmer was significantly shorter than other medieval professions due to the constant exposure to toxic gases, infectious diseases, and physical dangers associated with their work. The seasonal variations in medieval toilet conditions added another dimension to the challenges of castle sanitation. Winter made toilet use almost unbearably cold, with waste often freezing in the chutes and creating blockages that had to be cleared manually. The wooden toilet seats became so cold that they could cause frostbite on exposed skin, and the waste chutes often filled with ice that had to be broken up before normal toilet function could resume. Summer brought its own set of toilet-related challenges, including swarms of insects that bred in the waste areas and spread diseases throughout the castle community. The heat intensified odors to levels that could cause nausea and respiratory problems, while also accelerating the decomposition of waste in ways that created additional health hazards. Medieval people learned to time their toilet visits to avoid the worst effects of seasonal variations, but these adaptations only minimized rather than eliminated the dangers. Spring thaws could cause waste pits to overflow, flooding castle areas with sewage that took weeks to clean up properly. These seasonal floods contaminated water supplies, ruined food stores, and made large areas of the castle temporarily uninhabitable. Medieval people accepted these spring sewage floods as natural disasters similar to regular flooding, developing evacuation procedures and cleanup routines that helped them cope with the annual sanitation catastrophes. Medieval people developed various strategies for dealing with the unpleasant realities of castle toilet facilities, including the use of herbs and perfumes to mask odors, timing their toilet visits to avoid the worst conditions, and simply accepting levels of discomfort that would send modern people fleeing in horror. They also developed elaborate social customs around toilet use that allowed them to maintain dignity and propriety while dealing with facilities that were fundamentally undignified and improper by any modern standard. The psychological aspects of medieval toilet use were just as challenging as the physical realities. Modern people are accustomed to privacy, cleanliness, and safety when using bathroom facilities, and the medieval garderobe violates all of these expectations simultaneously. The constant awareness that you could fall to your death, be bitten by rats, or contract a fatal disease while performing basic biological functions created a level of anxiety around toilet use that modern people can barely comprehend. As you finally emerge from the garderobe, shaken by an experience that has redefined your understanding of human sanitation, you realize that medieval castle life challenged every assumption about basic human dignity and safety. The simple act of relieving yourself has become a dangerous expedition that tested your physical courage, social awareness, and psychological resilience. Your legs are shaking from the combination of fear and relief, and you're beginning to understand why medieval people had such different attitudes toward bodily functions than modern people do. But your medieval bathroom ordeal is just one of many challenges that await you as the day progresses, and the next test of your survival skills is already approaching. You're feeling slightly dizzy and nauseous, whether from the toxic fumes in the garderobe or from the stress of your increasingly dangerous castle experience. And you're about to discover that seeking medical help in medieval times involves treatments that are more likely to kill you than cure whatever ailments you might have developed. The dizziness and nausea you're experiencing after your garderobe adventure are about to introduce you to medieval medicine. And trust me when I say that you'd be better off praying for divine intervention than seeking help from a medieval physician. That queasy feeling in your stomach and the throbbing in your head might seem like minor discomforts that any modern doctor could treat with simple remedies. But in medieval times, these symptoms are about to trigger a cascade of medical interventions that could quite literally be the death of you. Word of your distress spreads quickly through the castle, because medieval people were constantly watching each other for signs of illness that could indicate the onset of plague, leprosy, or any of the dozens of other diseases that regularly swept through medieval communities. Within minutes, you're surrounded by well-meaning castle inhabitants who are offering medical advice based on centuries of accumulated superstition, religious doctrine, and medical theories that have no basis in actual science. The first person to offer help is an elderly woman who claims to be skilled in herbal remedies, and she's insisting that your symptoms are caused by an imbalance of your bodily humors that can only be corrected by consuming a mixture of ground beetles. Pulverized unicorn horn, which is actually narwhal Tuscan wine that's been blessed by a priest during a full moon. Medieval medicine was based on the theory that human health depended on maintaining the proper balance of 4 bodily fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that illness resulted from having too much or too little of any of these humors. This humoral theory sounds almost reasonable until you realize that medieval physicians diagnosed humor imbalances through methods that included examining the color and consistency of patients' urine, feeling the texture of their skin, and observing their emotional states during different phases of the moon. Your dizziness and nausea are being interpreted as signs that you have too much phlegm in your system, which means that the recommended treatment involves purging your body of excess moisture through bloodletting, induced vomiting, and consuming substances designed to dry out your internal organs. But before the herb woman can force her beetle concoction down your throat, a castle guard mentions that there's a barber surgeon available who can provide more sophisticated medical treatment. Medieval barber surgeons were the closest thing to professional medical practitioners that most people could access, and they combined hair cutting, tooth extraction, bloodletting, and basic surgery into a single terrifying profession that killed more patients than it saved. The barber surgeon who examines you is a cheerful, confident man who's covered in bloodstains from his previous patients and who's carrying a leather bag filled with instruments that look more like torture devices than medical tools. His diagnosis is swift and certain. You're suffering from an excess of hot blood that needs to be drained from your system immediately, and he's prepared to perform this life-saving bloodletting procedure right here in the castle courtyard, where everyone can watch and learn from your treatment. Medieval bloodletting was based on the belief that most illnesses were caused by having too much blood in the body, and that removing some of this excess blood would restore the patient's natural balance and cure their symptoms. This theory was so widely accepted that bloodletting was prescribed for everything from headaches to broken bones, and medieval physicians developed elaborate charts that specified exactly how much blood should be removed from patients of different ages, social classes, and astrological signs. The barber surgeon is preparing to open a vein in your arm with a rusty knife that's been used on dozens of previous patients without being properly cleaned, and he's explaining that the amount of blood he removes will depend on your astrological sign and the current phase of the moon. Medieval medicine was heavily influenced by astrology, and physicians believed that the position of celestial bodies affected both the onset of disease and the effectiveness of various treatments. Historians still argue whether medieval physicians genuinely believed in the effectiveness of their treatments or whether they simply continued using traditional methods because they had no alternatives. What's certain is that medieval medical practices killed enormous numbers of people who might have survived their original illnesses if they had been left alone to recover naturally. But bloodletting isn't the only treatment the barber surgeon is recommending for your condition. He's also suggesting that you need to have several teeth extracted, because medieval medical theory held that tooth decay could spread poison throughout the body and cause symptoms like dizziness and nausea. Medieval tooth extraction was performed without anesthesia using pliers-like instruments that often broke teeth rather than removing them cleanly, creating infected wounds that were more dangerous than the original dental problems. The dental situation in medieval times was particularly horrifying because medieval people had no understanding of dental hygiene and consumed diets that were terrible for tooth health. Most adults had severely decayed teeth by their 20s, and dental abscesses were so common that facial swelling from infected teeth was considered a normal part of aging. Medieval dentistry consisted mainly of pulling out teeth that had rotted beyond saving, and the procedure was so painful and dangerous that many people preferred to live with infected teeth rather than seek treatment. The barber surgeon is also recommending trepanation drilling holes in your skull to release the evil vapors that he believes are causing your dizziness. Medieval physicians thought that many neurological symptoms were caused by trapped air or evil spirits inside the skull, and they developed surgical techniques for boring holes in patients' heads to allow these harmful substances to escape. Surprisingly, some patients actually survived trepanation, possibly because the procedure occasionally relieved pressure from brain injuries, but most died from infection or blood loss during the surgery. While you're trying to avoid the barber surgeon's enthusiastic offers of medical care, a castle priest appears and suggests that your symptoms might be caused by spiritual rather than physical problems. Medieval Christianity held that illness was often a punishment for sin or a test of faith sent by God, and that spiritual remedies were often more effective than medical treatments. The priest is offering to perform an exorcism to drive out any demons that might be causing your illness, and he's warning that refusing spiritual treatment could indicate that you're in league with evil forces. Medieval exorcism procedures involved hours of prayers, holy water, and physical restraints that were designed to prevent possessed individuals from harming themselves or others during the ritual. These procedures were often more traumatic than the original symptoms they were supposed to treat, and many patients died from exhaustion, dehydration, or injuries sustained during violent exorcism rituals. However, refusing exorcism when it was recommended by church authorities could result in accusations of heresy or witchcraft, which carried their own deadly consequences. The religious aspect of medieval medicine created additional complications for anyone seeking treatment for illness. Medieval physicians were required to consider the spiritual implications of their treatments, and they often refused to treat patients who hadn't confessed their sins or received religious counseling. This meant that getting medical care often involved submitting to religious interrogation that could reveal information that might be used against you in future legal or political disputes. Medieval pharmaceutical treatments were just as dangerous as the surgical procedures. The castle's medicine chest contains substances that include mercury, lead, arsenic, and various plant extracts that are toxic in the doses that medieval physicians typically prescribed. Medieval people had no understanding of drug toxicity or proper dosing, so patients often died from poisoning caused by their medications rather than from their original illnesses. The herb woman is still insisting that you need to consume her beetle and unicorn horn mixture, and she's explaining that the beetles must be collected during specific lunar phases and ground up while still alive to maintain their medicinal properties. Medieval pharmacology was based on a combination of folk traditions, astrological beliefs, and religious doctrines that had no scientific basis, and many medieval remedies contained ingredients that were actively harmful to human health. Medieval physicians also practiced a form of treatment called sympathetic magic, where they used substances or procedures that supposedly resembled the patient's condition in order to cure it. For example, yellow substances were used to treat jaundice, red substances were used to treat bleeding, and treatments for head injuries involved ingredients that were shaped like human skulls. This approach to medicine was based on magical thinking rather than empirical observation, and it often resulted in treatments that made patients' conditions worse rather than better. The social dynamics of medieval medical care added another layer of danger to an already risky situation. Medieval physicians were typically members of the upper classes who had little practical medical experience, while the people who actually knew how to treat injuries and illnesses were often lower-class individuals whose knowledge was dismissed as superstition. This meant that patients often received treatment from people who had theoretical knowledge but no practical skills, while experienced healers were ignored or persecuted as witches. Medieval medical training was based on studying ancient texts rather than observing actual patients, and medical students were required to memorize the works of classical authors like Galen and Hippocrates without questioning whether these ancient theories were actually correct. This meant that medieval physicians often prescribed treatments that had been proven ineffective centuries earlier, but which continued to be used because they were considered authoritative by academic standards. The surgical instruments that the barber surgeon is displaying would horrify any modern medical professional. Medieval surgical tools were crude, often dirty, and typically used for multiple procedures without proper sterilization. The concept of infection control was completely unknown to medieval medicine, and surgical procedures were often performed in unsanitary conditions that guaranteed that patients would develop life-threatening infections even if the surgery itself was successful. Medieval anesthesia consisted mainly of alcohol and various plant extracts that could render patients unconscious, but which often caused more harm than the pain they were supposed to prevent. Medieval physicians had no understanding of proper anesthetic dosing, and many patients died from overdoses of pain-relieving substances or from complications caused by anesthetic drugs that affected their breathing or heart function. The diagnostic methods used by medieval physicians were based on examining patients' external appearance rather than understanding their internal conditions. Medieval doctors diagnosed illness by looking at the color of patients' skin, smelling their breath, tasting their urine, and feeling the texture of their hair. These diagnostic techniques provided no useful information about patients' actual health problems, but they were considered sophisticated medical practices by medieval standards. As you're desperately trying to avoid the various medical treatments being offered by the castle's healers, you're beginning to understand that seeking medical help in medieval times was often more dangerous than simply enduring illness without treatment. The combination of dangerous procedures, toxic medications, and complete ignorance of basic medical principles meant that medieval medicine killed far more people than it saved. The barber surgeon is becoming increasingly insistent that you need immediate bloodletting, and he's warning that delaying treatment could allow your condition to worsen into something that might require more drastic interventions like amputation or skull drilling. Medieval physicians believed that early intervention was essential for treating illness, but their interventions were so dangerous that patients were often better off avoiding medical care entirely. Your modern immune system and medical knowledge are telling you to run away from these medieval medical practitioners as fast as possible, but refusing treatment could mark you as someone with suspicious knowledge or beliefs that might indicate heretical thinking. Medieval people who rejected conventional medical wisdom were sometimes accused of practicing witchcraft or of having supernatural knowledge that came from evil sources. As the crowd of helpful castle inhabitants continues to grow around you, offering increasingly bizarre and dangerous medical advice, you realize that your minor symptoms have attracted the kind of medical attention that could easily prove fatal. The morning's challenges have been difficult, but they've been nothing compared to the life-threatening situation you now face as the target of medieval medical care that's more likely to kill you than cure whatever minor ailments you might have developed from your castle adventure. Thankfully, you managed to escape the enthusiastic medical attention by claiming that you're feeling much better and need to return to your assigned duty. It's a lie that works because medieval people understood that work was more important than health complaints. But your relief is short-lived, because you're about to discover that medieval castle work assignments could kill you in ways that would make the barber surgeon's bloodletting seem like a relaxing spa treatment. The castle overseer who's been looking for you has a list of daily tasks that need to be completed, and your modern body is absolutely not prepared for the physical demands of medieval labor. Your first assignment is helping to move stones for repairs to the castle wall, and you quickly discover that medieval construction work was essentially a form of legalized torture that killed workers regularly and crippled the survivors. The stones you're expected to lift and carry weigh more than most modern people can handle, and there are no mechanical aids, safety equipment, or ergonomic considerations to help you manage the workload. Medieval workers simply accepted that construction work would destroy their bodies over time, and they planned their lives around the assumption that they would be physically disabled by their 30s. The other workers on the construction crew are men who've been doing this type of labor since childhood, and their bodies show the effects of decades of abuse that would horrify modern occupational safety inspectors. They have missing fingers from stone-cutting accidents, permanent back injuries from lifting heavy loads, and respiratory problems from breathing stone dust without protection. These injuries aren't considered workplace accidents theory, just the normal cost of making a living in medieval times, and workers who complained about dangerous conditions were quickly replaced by others who were desperate enough to accept any paying work. Medieval construction sites operated without any of the safety regulations that modern workers take for granted. There are no hard hats, safety harnesses, or protective barriers around dangerous areas. Workers routinely climbed on unstable scaffolding made from lashed-together poles, carried heavy loads across narrow planks suspended over deadly drops, and operated dangerous tools without any safety training. Medieval construction accidents killed thousands of workers every year, but these deaths were considered normal business expenses rather than preventable tragedies. The tools you're expected to use are as dangerous to the workers as they are effective for construction. Medieval hammers, chisels, and picks were heavy, poorly balanced, and prone to breaking under stress, often sending sharp metal fragments flying in unpredictable directions. The handles of these tools were roughly carved wood that could splinter and cause hand injuries, and the metal heads were often poorly attached and could fly off during use, potentially killing nearby workers. But the stone-moving assignment is just the beginning of your workday. After several hours of backbreaking labor that leaves you feeling like you've been hit by a truck, you're reassigned to help in the castle stables, where you'll discover that medieval animal care involved risks that would terrify modern veterinarians. Medieval horses were larger, more aggressive, and less domesticated than modern horses, and they were often in pain from poor nutrition, inadequate medical care, and harsh treatment that made them unpredictable and dangerous. The stable work involves mucking out horse stalls, feeding animals, and maintaining equipment, all while working in close proximity to animals that could kill you with a single kick. Medieval people had a much more casual relationship with animal danger than modern people do, and stable workers regularly sustained serious injuries from bites, kicks, and being trampled by animals that were stressed, sick, or simply in bad moods. These injuries were considered part of the job, and workers who couldn't handle dangerous animals were considered weak and unsuitable for stable work. Medieval horse care involved procedures that would violate every animal welfare regulation ever written. Horses were often kept in conditions that were cramped, unsanitary, and psychologically stressful, and they were treated with harsh discipline that included beating, starvation, and other forms of abuse that were considered normal training methods. Sick horses received medical care that was often more harmful than their original illnesses, including bloodletting, toxic medications, and surgical procedures performed without anesthesia. The stable environment itself presents health hazards that could kill you slowly through exposure or quickly through accidents. Medieval stables were filled with toxic gases from decomposing animal waste, and the dust from hay and straw contained mold spores and other substances that could cause serious respiratory problems. The wooden construction of medieval stables made them fire hazards that could trap workers and animals in deadly blazes that spread with terrifying speed. Historians still argue whether medieval workers were aware of the long-term health consequences of their dangerous working conditions, or whether they simply accepted these risks because they had no choice but to work or starve. What's clear is that medieval labor practices created conditions that would be considered criminal negligence by modern standards. Yet medieval people had no legal recourse for workplace injuries and no social safety net to support workers who were disabled by their jobs. After surviving several hours of stable work that left you covered in animal waste and nursing multiple minor injuries, you're assigned to help in the castle kitchen, where you'll discover that medieval food preparation involved dangers that went far beyond the risk of food poisoning. Medieval kitchens were essentially controlled fires surrounded by flammable materials, toxic fumes, and sharp instruments wielded by overworked, underpaid workers who had little incentive to prioritize safety over productivity. The kitchen fires that provided heat for cooking were open flames that filled the air with smoke and created constant fire hazards that could consume entire castles within hours. Medieval cooks worked in conditions where a single careless moment could result in severe burns, smoke inhalation, or death in a kitchen fire. The combination of open flames, wooden construction, and flammable cooking materials made medieval kitchens some of the most dangerous workplaces in an era when all workplaces were deadly. Medieval cooking involved handling boiling liquids, sharp knives, and heavy cooking implements without any of the safety equipment that modern commercial kitchens require. Kitchen workers regularly suffered burns from splashing oil, cuts from poorly maintained knives, and crushing injuries from heavy pots and cooking equipment. The fast pace of kitchen work meant that injuries often went untreated until they became infected or disabled, and kitchen workers learned to continue working despite injuries that would send modern workers to emergency rooms. The food preparation itself involved handling ingredients that were often spoiled, contaminated, or toxic, creating health risks that medieval kitchen workers simply accepted as part of their job. Medieval cooks worked with meat that was beginning to rot, vegetables that were infested with insects, and dairy products that had gone bad days earlier. The constant exposure to contaminated food meant that kitchen workers suffered from chronic digestive problems, food poisoning, and parasitic infections that shortened their lifespans and reduced their quality of life. Medieval kitchen work also involved preparing foods that were inherently dangerous when handled improperly. Medieval cooks worked with live animals that could bite or scratch them, handled sharp bones that could cause cuts and puncture wounds, and prepared foods using techniques that created toxic fumes and dangerous chemical reactions. The lack of food safety knowledge meant that kitchen workers often poisoned themselves and others through ignorance of basic food handling principles. Your kitchen assignment involves helping to prepare the evening meal, which means working with ingredients and cooking methods that would horrify modern health inspectors. You're expected to handle raw meat that's been sitting at room temperature for days. Work with cooking fires that fill the air with toxic smoke, and use knives and other implements that are dirty, dull, and dangerous to handle. The other kitchen workers are suffering from various health problems caused by their working conditions, including respiratory problems from breathing smoke and food dust, chronic burns from working with open fires, and digestive issues from constantly tasting contaminated food. These health problems aren't considered workplace injuries theory, just the normal consequences of working in a medieval kitchen. And workers who complained about dangerous conditions were quickly replaced by others who were willing to accept the risks. Medieval kitchen hierarchy added another layer of danger to an already risky work environment. Kitchen workers were expected to follow orders without question, even when those orders involved dangerous or obviously unsafe practices. Questioning the judgment of higher-ranking kitchen staff could result in punishment that included physical beatings, reduction in pay, or dismissal without references that would make finding other work nearly impossible. The pace of medieval kitchen work was determined by the needs of castle inhabitants rather than the safety or comfort of kitchen workers. During busy periods, kitchen staff worked from before dawn until after dark, handling dangerous equipment and toxic substances while exhausted and stressed. The combination of fatigue and dangerous working conditions meant that kitchen accidents were more frequent during busy periods, but the work still had to be completed regardless of the human cost. Medieval food preservation techniques added additional dangers to kitchen work that modern people would find unacceptable. Kitchen workers handled foods that had been preserved with toxic chemicals, worked with fermented foods that produced harmful gases, and prepared foods using techniques that created dangerous chemical reactions. The lack of understanding about food chemistry meant that medieval cooks often exposed themselves and others to toxic substances without realizing the health risks they were creating. As you struggle through your kitchen assignment, dodging flames, handling contaminated food, and trying to avoid serious injuries from dangerous equipment, you're beginning to understand that medieval work assignments weren't just physically demanding, they were actively life-threatening in ways that made every day of work a survival challenge. The combination of dangerous conditions, inadequate safety measures, and complete ignorance of occupational health principles meant that medieval workers faced constant risks that would be considered intolerable by modern standards. Your workday is far from over, and you're already exhausted from hours of dangerous labor that have left you with minor injuries, respiratory problems from breathing toxic fumes, and a growing awareness that medieval work could kill you in dozens of different ways. The other workers around you are showing the cumulative effects of years of dangerous labor, and you're beginning to realize that surviving medieval castle life wasn't just about avoiding obvious dangers like warfare or disease. It was about enduring daily work assignments that slowly destroyed workers' bodies and minds through constant exposure to hazards that medieval people simply accepted as normal parts of life. But your most dangerous working hours are still ahead of you, because medieval castle work continued long after sunset, and nighttime labor involved additional risks that made dangerous daytime work seem safe by comparison. The approaching darkness brings new challenges that will test your survival skills in ways you never imagined possible, and the day's accumulated fatigue and injuries are making you increasingly vulnerable to the deadly hazards that await you in the medieval night. As the sun begins to set behind the castle walls, you might think your grueling workday is finally coming to an end, but medieval castle life doesn't pause for darkness. It becomes exponentially more dangerous. The approaching night brings challenges that make your daytime struggles seem like a leisurely stroll through a modern park. Medieval people lived in terror of nightfall, not because of supernatural fears, but because darkness transformed every ordinary activity into a potentially fatal encounter with hazards that you can't see coming until it's too late to avoid them. Your first introduction to medieval nighttime dangers comes when you're assigned to help with evening torch lighting, a task that sounds simple until you realize that medieval castles after dark were essentially death traps waiting to claim unwary victims. The narrow stone corridors that were merely inconvenient during daylight become treacherous obstacle courses when illuminated only by flickering torches that create dancing shadows and leave huge areas in complete darkness. Medieval people developed special walking techniques for navigating dark castle passages, feeling their way along walls and testing each step before putting their full weight on potentially unstable surfaces. The torches themselves represent a constant fire hazard that could kill everyone in the castle within hours if something goes wrong. Medieval torches were made from bundles of resinous wood or cloth soaked in animal fat, and they dripped burning material constantly while filling the air with toxic smoke that could cause respiratory problems or unconsciousness. Castle inhabitants learned to live with the constant awareness that a single drop torch could ignite tapestries, rushes, or wooden furniture and create an unstoppable fire that would consume the entire structure. Medieval people had developed elaborate fire prevention protocols that everyone in the castle was expected to follow religiously, because fire was one of the most common causes of death in medieval times. These protocols included designated torch-carrying routes, specific procedures for extinguishing torches safely, and emergency evacuation plans that were practiced regularly. However, These safety measures were primitive by modern standards, and castle fires still occurred frequently enough that most medieval people expected to lose their homes and possessions to fire at least once during their lifetimes. But fire isn't the only danger that emerges with darkness in medieval castles. The night shift brings out human predators who use the cover of darkness to commit crimes that would be impossible during daylight hours. Medieval castles were filled with desperate people who survived through theft, violence, and other illegal activities, and nighttime provided cover for criminal enterprises that ranged from simple pickpocketing to armed robbery and murder. The castle's security system, such as it exists, was designed primarily to keep external enemies out rather than to protect inhabitants from each other. Once you're inside the castle walls, you're largely on your own when it comes to personal safety, and the darkness makes it easy for criminals to operate without being identified or caught. Medieval castle crime was often organized and sophisticated, with networks of thieves, con artists, and violent criminals who preyed on unsuspecting victims who didn't understand the unwritten rules of medieval criminal behavior. Your evening assignment involves carrying messages between different areas of the castle, which means navigating dark corridors alone while carrying items that could mark you as a robbery target. Medieval messengers were frequently attacked, robbed, and sometimes killed for the messages they carried or simply for the valuables they might be carrying. The darkness makes it impossible to identify potential threats until they're close enough to harm you, and your modern instincts for personal safety are completely inadequate for dealing with medieval criminal tactics. Medieval castle criminals operated with sophisticated knowledge of castle layouts, guard routines, and the movements of potential victims. They knew which corridors were poorly lit, which areas were rarely patrolled, and which times of night offered the best opportunities for criminal activity. Your ignorance of these criminal patterns makes you an ideal target for predators who can spot your vulnerability from a distance and plan their attacks accordingly. The legal system that was supposed to protect castle inhabitants from crime was largely ineffective after dark, because medieval law enforcement operated primarily during daylight hours. Night watches existed in some castles, but they were often understaffed, poorly equipped, and more concerned with external threats than internal crime. This meant that criminals who operated under cover of darkness could often avoid detection and punishment, creating an environment where nighttime crime flourished. Historians still argue whether medieval castle crime rates were actually higher than modern crime rates, or whether medieval people were simply more vulnerable to criminal activity due to poor lighting and inadequate law enforcement. What's clear is that medieval people lived with constant awareness of criminal threats that modern people rarely have to consider, and they developed survival strategies for dealing with these dangers that reflected the harsh realities of medieval life. As you navigate the dark corridors carrying your messages, you encounter other castle inhabitants who are going about their nighttime business, and you quickly realize that not everyone you meet after dark can be trusted. Medieval people were skilled at reading subtle signals that indicated whether strangers were potential allies or threats, but your modern social skills are useless for interpreting medieval behavioral cues that could warn you about dangerous individuals. The psychological effects of medieval darkness were just as challenging as the physical dangers. Medieval people lived with constant awareness that night brought increased risks of fire, crime, accident, and death, and this awareness created a level of chronic stress that modern people can barely comprehend. The simple act of moving through a dark castle required constant vigilance and anxiety that would exhaust modern people who aren't accustomed to living in a state of perpetual alertness. Medieval lighting technology was so primitive that even well-lit areas of the castle remained relatively dark by modern standards. Candles were expensive and provided minimal illumination, Torches created fire hazards and toxic smoke, and oil lamps were unreliable and dangerous to operate. Most castle inhabitants simply accepted that darkness was a natural part of life and developed strategies for functioning with minimal light that required skills and adaptations that modern people have never had to develop. Your message-carrying assignment takes you to parts of the castle that you haven't seen before, and you discover that medieval castles were designed with defensive features that became serious hazards for anyone moving through them in darkness. Hidden passages, secret doors, trap mechanisms, and deliberately confusing layouts were designed to confuse enemies, but they also created dangers for legitimate castle inhabitants who could easily become lost or injured while trying to navigate unfamiliar areas. The castle's waste management system becomes particularly hazardous after dark, when the already dangerous garderobe facilities become nearly impossible to use safely. Medieval people developed techniques for using toilet facilities in darkness, but these techniques required experience and knowledge that you don't possess. The combination of poor lighting, slippery surfaces, and dangerous heights made nighttime toilet use a genuinely life-threatening activity that claimed regular victims. Medieval castle inhabitants also had to deal with nocturnal animals that created additional dangers after dark. Rats, bats, cats, and various other creatures became more active at night, and encounters with these animals could result in bites, scratches, and disease transmission that could be life-threatening in an era without modern medical care. Medieval people learned to coexist with these nocturnal animals, but their presence added another layer of unpredictability to nighttime castle life. The temperature variations between day and night in medieval castles created health risks that were particularly dangerous for people who weren't accustomed to extreme temperature changes. Medieval stone construction provided little insulation, and nighttime temperatures could drop dramatically even during summer months. The combination of cold temperatures, poor clothing, and inadequate heating meant that hypothermia was a constant threat for castle inhabitants who didn't have access to warm sleeping areas. Your evening work assignment continues with tasks that become increasingly dangerous as the darkness deepens and your fatigue accumulates. Medieval work schedules didn't accommodate human circadian rhythms or safety considerations, and workers were expected to maintain productivity and alertness regardless of lighting conditions or personal exhaustion. The combination of dangerous working conditions and impaired visibility meant that nighttime workplace accidents were common and often fatal. Medieval castle inhabitants developed elaborate social protocols for nighttime interactions that were designed to reduce the risks of misunderstandings that could lead to violence. These protocols included specific ways of announcing your presence in dark areas, procedures for identifying yourself to guards and other castle inhabitants, and behavioral codes that signaled peaceful intentions. Your ignorance of these protocols makes every nighttime encounter a potential source of conflict that could escalate into violence. The mental health effects of medieval castle life became particularly pronounced during nighttime hours, when the combination of darkness, isolation, and constant danger created psychological stresses that would challenge even mentally healthy individuals. Medieval people had no understanding of mental health issues, and they dealt with anxiety, depression, and trauma through religious practices, alcohol consumption, and social support systems that were primitive by modern standards. As your evening work assignment continues, you're beginning to understand that medieval nighttime wasn't just about enduring darkness, it was about surviving in an environment where every familiar daytime activity became potentially lethal when performed without adequate lighting. The simple act of walking from one room to another required planning, preparation, and constant vigilance that modern people have never had to develop. Your modern eyes, accustomed to electric lighting and predictable illumination, are struggling to adapt to the minimal light provided by medieval torches and candles. Medieval people developed superior night vision through lifelong exposure to low light conditions. But your eyes lack these adaptations and leave you vulnerable to accidents and attacks that medieval people might be able to avoid through better visual perception. The night is still young, and you have hours of dangerous activity ahead of you before you can even think about finding a place to sleep. Medieval castle nights were long, dangerous, and filled with challenges that tested every survival skill that castle inhabitants had developed through years of experience. Your modern survival skills are proving inadequate for dealing with medieval nighttime dangers, and you're beginning to realize that simply living through a single night in a medieval castle would require knowledge, skills, and physical capabilities that most modern people have never had to develop. But your nighttime ordeal is approaching its most dangerous phase, because medieval castle nights culminated in encounters with a legal and justice system that operated according to principles that would horrify any modern person who believes in human rights, due process, or proportional punishment. The darkness that has made every activity more dangerous is about to introduce you to medieval justice, where minor infractions could result in public torture and death sentences that were carried out immediately and without appeal. As midnight approaches and your exhausting day in the medieval castle draws toward its conclusion, you're about to witness or possibly participate in the final horror that would convince any modern person that time travel to the medieval era would be a one-way ticket to hell. The castle's justice system is about to demonstrate why medieval people lived in constant terror not just of criminals, but of the legal authorities who were supposed to protect them. Tonight, there's going to be a trial, and the medieval approach to justice will make everything else you've experienced seem like minor inconveniences compared to the barbaric spectacle of medieval law enforcement. Word spreads quickly through the castle that someone has been caught stealing bread from the kitchens, and this apparently minor crime is about to trigger a legal process that would violate every human rights convention ever written. Medieval justice operated on principles that modern people would recognize as torture, terrorism, and state-sanctioned murder, all disguised as legitimate law enforcement. The concept of proportional punishment was completely foreign to medieval legal thinking, where stealing a loaf of bread could result in the same penalties as committing murder. You're drawn into the crowd gathering in the castle courtyard, where a makeshift tribunal has been assembled to try the accused thief. The judge is a local noble who has no legal training whatsoever, but who has absolute authority to determine guilt, innocence, and punishment according to his personal whims and political interests. Medieval legal proceedings weren't about determining truth or dispensing justice. They were about maintaining social order through public displays of power that terrified potential criminals into submission. The accused thief is a young woman who's obviously suffering from malnutrition and desperation, but medieval justice made no allowances for circumstances, necessity, or social conditions that might drive people to commit crimes. She's been stripped of her clothing and chained to a wooden post while the judge examines the evidence against her, which consists mainly of the testimony of a kitchen servant who claims to have seen her near the bread storage area. Medieval legal standards for evidence were so low that accusations were often treated as proof of guilt, especially when the accused person lacked social status or political connections. The trial proceeds with a speed that would shock modern legal observers, because medieval justice prioritized efficiency over accuracy. The judge listens to the accusations, asks the defendant if she has anything to say in her defense, is too terrified to speak coherently, and immediately pronounces her guilty of theft. The entire legal proceeding takes less than 10 minutes, and there are no appeals, no legal representation, and no consideration of mitigating circumstances that might justify a lesser punishment. The punishment phase of medieval trials was where the system revealed its true barbarity. And you're about to witness firsthand why medieval people lived in constant terror of the justice system that was supposed to protect them. The judge announces that the convicted thief will be subjected to trial by ordeal to determine the appropriate level of punishment, which means that she'll be tortured until she confesses to additional crimes or until the torture kills her, whichever comes first. Medieval trial by ordeal was based on the religious belief that God would intervene to protect innocent people from harm. So anyone who suffered during the ordeal must be guilty of additional sins that deserved punishment. This circular logic meant that trial by ordeal always resulted in convictions, because innocent people who were tortured were assumed to be guilty of other crimes, while guilty people who were tortured were simply receiving the punishment they deserved. The ordeal device being prepared for the bread thief is a red-hot iron brand that will be pressed against her skin to burn the sign of the cross into her forehead, marking her permanently as a convicted criminal. Medieval societies used permanent physical mutilation as both punishment and identification system, creating a population of visibly marked former criminals who could never escape their past convictions or reintegrate into normal society. Historians still argue whether medieval people genuinely believed in the religious justifications for their brutal justice system, or whether they simply used religious doctrine to justify legal practices that were designed to maintain social control through terror. What's certain is that medieval justice was explicitly designed to be cruel, public, and memorable, creating fear that would deter crime more effectively than any modern rehabilitation program. But the branding is just the beginning of the convicted thief's ordeal. Medieval punishments were designed to be cumulative and progressive, with each stage of punishment providing opportunities for additional confessions that could trigger even more severe penalties. After the branding, the thief will be subjected to public flogging with a whip made from leather strips embedded with metal fragments that will tear her skin and potentially cause fatal infections. The public nature of medieval punishment was just as important as the physical suffering it inflicted. Medieval justice was performed as public entertainment that the entire castle community was expected to attend and enjoy. People brought food and drink to punishment events, placed bets on how long victims would survive their ordeals, and treated executions and torture sessions as social gatherings that combined entertainment with moral instruction. The crowd around you is reacting to the unfolding punishment with enthusiasm that would horrify any modern observer. Medieval people had been conditioned from childhood to view extreme violence as normal and justified, and they genuinely enjoyed watching other people suffer in ways that modern people would find psychologically disturbing. The combination of religious justification, social conditioning, and entertainment value made medieval punishment events popular community activities that brought people together in celebration of legalized sadism. As the branding iron is heated in a brazier that fills the air with smoke and the smell of hot metal, you realize that your own situation is becoming increasingly precarious. Medieval justice operated on the principle of guilt by association, and anyone who showed sympathy for criminals or discomfort with punishment procedures could be accused of harboring criminal sympathies themselves. Your modern revulsion at the torture you're witnessing could be interpreted as evidence that you're a criminal sympathizer who deserves investigation and possibly punishment. The medieval concept of criminal justice extended far beyond individual crimes to include family members, associates, and even casual acquaintances of accused criminals. Medieval people believed that criminal behavior was contagious and that anyone who associated with criminals was likely to be corrupted by their influence. This meant that being present at a criminal trial could result in scrutiny of your own behavior and background that might reveal information that could be used against you. The legal procedures being used against the bread thief would be considered torture and human rights violations by any modern standard, but medieval people viewed these practices as necessary and just applications of divine law. Medieval legal theory held that criminals forfeited their right to humane treatment when they chose to violate social norms, and that extreme punishment was necessary to cleanse society of criminal influences that could spread like a spiritual disease. The religious justifications for medieval punishment were elaborate and sophisticated, drawing on centuries of theological scholarship that rationalized extreme cruelty as expressions of divine justice. Medieval clergy actively participated in torture and execution procedures, providing religious ceremonies that blessed the instruments of torture and offered prayers for the souls of criminals who were being killed in service to God's justice. As the branding proceeds and the convicted thief's screams echo off the stone walls of the castle courtyard, you're witnessing the intersection of religion, law, and social control that defined medieval civilization. The torture being inflicted isn't seen as cruelty, it's viewed as a sacred ritual that purifies the community by removing criminal influences and demonstrating God's power to punish those who violate his laws. The medical aspects of medieval punishment were designed to maximize suffering while keeping victims alive long enough to endure multiple stages of torture. Medieval executioners were skilled professionals who understood human anatomy well enough to inflict extreme pain without causing immediate death, and they took pride in their ability to prolong punishment procedures for hours or even days. But your own danger is increasing as the punishment spectacle continues, because medieval crowds at justice events often became excited enough to demand additional victims for their entertainment. The psychology of mob violence was well understood by medieval authorities, who sometimes used public punishment events to identify and eliminate political enemies or social undesirables who could be accused of crimes and subjected to immediate punishment without formal trials. The bread thief's ordeal is approaching its final stages, and the crowd is calling for her execution despite the relatively minor nature of her original crime. Medieval justice operated on the principle that any crime, no matter how small, revealed a criminal nature that could only be eliminated through death. The progression from petty theft to execution was considered logical and necessary, reflecting medieval beliefs about the irredeemable nature of criminal behavior. The execution method being prepared is hanging, which was considered a merciful form of death that was appropriate for criminals who had shown some cooperation during their torture. Medieval hanging was designed to be slow and painful, with victims typically taking several minutes to die from strangulation rather than from the quick neck-breaking that characterizes modern execution methods. As you watch this horrific spectacle unfold, you're beginning to understand that medieval justice wasn't an aberration or a temporary failure of civilization. It was a sophisticated system designed to maintain social order through terror, spectacle, and the complete dehumanization of anyone who violated social norms. The legal principles underlying medieval punishment would persist for centuries and continue to influence justice systems long after the medieval period ended. The psychological impact of witnessing medieval justice was intended to be permanent and traumatic, creating memories that would deter potential criminals for the rest of their lives. Medieval people were expected to carry the images and sounds of punishment events with them always, using these memories as internal controls that would prevent them from considering criminal behavior. Your modern psyche is rebelling against the sadistic spectacle you're witnessing, but your emotional response could mark you as someone with suspicious sympathies that deserve investigation. Medieval society demanded enthusiastic participation in punishment events, and anyone who failed to show appropriate enjoyment of criminal suffering could be suspected of harboring criminal tendencies themselves. As the bread thief's life ebbs away at the end of a rope while the crowd cheers and celebrates, You realize that everything you've experienced during your day in the medieval castle, the cold, the filth, the disease, the dangerous work, and the social complexities, has been leading up to this moment of ultimate horror. Medieval civilization was built on a foundation of legalized brutality that would be considered criminal by any modern standard. Yet medieval people accepted this system as natural, necessary, and divinely ordained. The night is finally ending, but your medieval ordeal has left you with an understanding of human nature and social organization that will haunt you forever. You've witnessed a civilization that combined sophisticated culture, religious devotion, and complex social organization with levels of casual brutality that modern people can barely comprehend. The contrast between medieval achievements and medieval cruelties reveals something fundamental about human nature that comfort-loving modern people prefer not to acknowledge. As the crowd begins to disperse and the castle prepares for another day of medieval life, you understand why time travel to the medieval era would be a nightmare that most modern people couldn't survive physically, psychologically, or morally. Medieval life required adaptations and compromises that would destroy the humanity of anyone raised with modern values. Yet millions of people lived these lives for centuries without any alternative or hope of escape. Your day in a medieval castle is ending, but the lessons you've learned about human resilience, social organization, and the thin veneer of civilization that separates comfort from horror will stay with you forever. Medieval people weren't monsters, they were humans living in conditions that required monstrous adaptations for survival, and their civilization succeeded precisely because it created systems that modern people would consider evil, but which were effective for maintaining order in a world where life was brutal, short, and constantly threatened by dangers that could destroy entire communities without warning. Now close your eyes and let these dark images of medieval life fade into the gentler darkness of sleep. The harsh stone walls dissolve into the softness of your modern bed. The acrid smoke of torches becomes the clean air of your climate-controlled room. And the screams of medieval justice fade into the peaceful silence of a world where human rights exist and suffering has limits. Rest now in the knowledge that you live in an age of unprecedented comfort and safety, built on centuries of human progress that slowly transformed the brutal realities of medieval life into the civilization you wake up to every morning. The castle gates close behind you forever, and you return to a world where survival doesn't require the daily compromise of your humanity. Sweet dreams, and be grateful for the ordinary miracles of modern life that protect you from the extraordinary horrors of our ancestors' existence.